Iklim Inspirasi Inforia Islami. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi taala wabarakatuh. And welcome to another episode of Open Forum. Alhamdulillah. With me this evening, inshallah, we have a very special guest with us to talk about an interesting topic. And I think the topic is very much in line with many of our discussions for the previous episodes. So inshallah, we'll be talking to Professor Dr. Syed Khairuddin Al-Junied on the topic of Islam and peaceful coexistence in Southeast Asia. Welcome to Open Forum, Prof.
Thank you very much for including me into this discussion.
Right, and then thank you for accepting our invitation to be on Open Forum, and we will be talking about, I think, a topic which is very close to your heart, and from what I've read about what you have written, and also many publications that you have actually published on this particular topic, I think you are the most suitable person to talk about our discussion today. So inshallah. So, but before we go to the main or the core of our discussion this evening, Prof, we would like to actually introduce you to our fellow listeners on IKIM Radio. Prof. Dr. Syed Khairuddin Al-Junied is currently a professor at the Faculty of Arts and Social Science, University of Malaya, and previous affiliation includes as a professor of Southeast Asian Islamic and Intellectual History at University of Brunei Darussalam, at the and also at the National University of Singapore. And you were also previously a senior fellow at the Al-Walid Center for Muslim Christian Understanding, Georgetown University. You are considered as an expert in this particular area, and you are recognized specialist in the study of Islam in Southeast Asia. You are the author and editor of 12 books and 37, I think more than that, of internationally referred articles. And among your publications are Colonialism, Violence and Muslim in Southeast Asia in 2009, Radicals, Resistance and Protest in the Colonial Malaya in 2016, Muslim Cosmopolitanism, Southeast Asian Islam in Comparative Perspective, and Hamka and Islam, Cosmopolitan Reform in the Malay World, and Islam in Malaysia, and Intertwined History. And I think recently, last year in December 2022, you launched your latest publication. I think some of our listeners are also familiar with this publication, is Shapers of Islamic Thought in Southeast Asia. So welcome again to our program, Prof. We are going to talk about Islam and peaceful coexistence in Southeast Asia. For our previous topics that we have actually bring experts to talk about peaceful coexistence, but specifically on Islam and its role in Southeast Asia, and also how Islam actually an important force in bringing about peaceful coexistence. But before we go further, Prof, we know that historically Islam in Southeast Asia is actually a complex and diverse narrative that spans over 100 of years, especially in the context of this region. Would you like to share as an introduction, and also to our listeners, some insights on Islam's arrival in Southeast Asia, Prof?
Okay, so what's interesting about Islam in Southeast Asia, as it is the study of global Islam as a whole, is that Islam is the youngest religion in the region. Muslims were Hindus and Buddhists, and they worshipped ancestors for hundreds and thousands of years. And Islam has been around, not really very recent, for more than 1,000 years. And in my book, Islam in Malaysia, I emphasize that Muslims had already come to this region for a very long time. In fact, it was during the time of the companions of the prophets. But what's more interesting, and this is something that I mentioned in my book, Islam in Malaysia and Entwined History, is that the story of Islam in Malaysia is entwined with the story of other communities in the region. And this is very, very interesting because Islam in Southeast Asia spread partly because of the ability and the openness of non-Muslims in accepting Muslims to bring and share their religion in the region. When we talk about Muslims coming to Southeast Asia, what's interesting is that not only the Arabs played a big role in the spread of Islam, we know that the Chinese from China came. They were already converted to Islam as early as the late 7th and 8th century. They brought Islam into the region alongside other missionaries from Persia, what we call today as Iran, and also especially from India, because the Indians were already engaging in trade. And when Islam came to India and converted many of these Indians, especially in the north, and later on through the Indian Ocean in the south, the Indians then brought goods and traded not only the things that they wanted to sell, but also shared about their religion. So that's one of the interesting insight. The other
Yeah.
interesting insight is that, when I mentioned this in another book called Muslim Cosmopolitanism, Southeast Asian Islam in Comparative Perspective, is that the process was very, very cosmopolitan. What do we mean by this? Is that the concept or the spread of Islam involve interactions not only at the level of the intellect, but also interactions at the level of cultures and customs, where Muslims shared their cultures and customs, and non-Muslims incorporated these cultures and customs into the body of their own systems. And through it, Muslims change partly the worldview of the locals, the worldviews of the Buddhists, the Hindus, and other communities in the region to bring about a hybridized way of living. So even though not all Southeast Asians converted to Islam, they then take in some of the Muslim cultures and made it part and parcel of their own culture. So we have today the rise of very cosmopolitan communities all over Southeast Asia. So it's such an interesting history where Islam came not to impose itself onto the religions that are already there in Southeast Asia,
Yeah.
but a religion that came gradually, peacefully, even though there were conflicts. We cannot deny that there were wars and conquests, but
Yeah.
by and large, the historical balance sheet has shown us that the whole process was a very smooth, gradualist, and progressive one.
You've mentioned about cosmopolitanism. Um, can you just explain to our listeners, Prof, about the concept of cosmopolitan in the sense of how Islam actually helped this the rise of this aspect in Southeast Asia?
Yeah, so in my book, what I argued was that Islam in Southeast Asia manifests what I call as Muslim cosmopolitanism. What I mean by Muslim cosmopolitanism is not an ideology that is taken from the outside. Nowadays, when we use words like cosmopolitan and so forth, the first response from Muslims would be, this is a foreign idea. And that's why he published his book in a foreign publication. But that
Yeah.
is not true. I mentioned in the book that the idea of Muslim cosmopolitanism actually came from Islam itself. When we look at Surah Al-Hujurat,
Yeah.
ayat number 13, Allah says very clearly that at the end of the day, we are called upon and we are created by God to get to know one another. The most
Yeah.
noble amongst you is the one who is most humble, and the one who has the highest taqwa in the eyes of God. And what Muslims that came in Southeast Asia did was precisely this, to share what they believed, but not only to share what they believed to impose it upon others, but to share what they believe, their way of life, their worldviews, in a manner that would benefit the societies that they encountered. Hence,
Right.
the idea of Muslim cosmopolitanism also incorporated the whole idea of the maqasid sharia, that when Muslims they were concerned with the enrichment of the mind, of property, of lineage, and
Yeah.
so forth and so forth that constitutes the maqasid. In fact, in my book, I mentioned that one of the interesting thing about the people who brought Islam into Southeast Asia and the Southeast Asians who adopted Islam is that their idea of the Maqasid Sharia was not merely an intellectual construct. We hear a lot of the Maqasid Sharia today, a lot of discourses and discussions over it. But for Southeast Asians, especially for the Malays, Indonesians, and others, they did
Yeah.
not talk about it. They manifested it. They embodied it. They lived it. They showed how one should live one's life in such a way that anybody else could flourish within the environment that you were in. So this is the interesting part. I mean, it is not a theoretical concept, but rather
Yeah.
it is a grounded theory that is based on the everyday experiences of Muslims in Southeast Asia.
All right. Interesting, Prof. You raised about how actually the arrival of Islam actually it's not just how as we understood it all this while, but the dynamic of the different aspect of what brought Islam to, especially in the region, is very important for us to understand. Um, with the arrival of Islam, Prof, how did actually it impact the social structure of Southeast Asia? If you can share, Prof.
Yeah, so we need to understand that with the coming of Islam in Southeast Asia and in other parts of the world, not
Mm-hmm.
everything that was there in the communities that Muslims encountered changed. So there is this concept in Islamic law called al-thawabit wal mutaghayyirat,
Yeah.
that there are things that are uh, unchangeable and there are
Mhm.
things that are changeable. What the
Yeah.
Muslims emphasized in the past was to change the manner to which Southeast Asians thought about God. And that was the first emphasis. So they were correcting the whole idea of the belief in many gods to what Professor Usman Bakar emphasized as the Tawhidic way of thinking or the Tawhidic epistemology and paradigm. And that was
Mm-hmm.
changed. And in fact, Muslims then adopted a new way of looking at what they call as Tuhan. Tuhan means God, into the whole idea of Tuhan yang Maha Esa. From that, everything else followed. When the minds of the locals were changed, their social structure were also affected. And
Mm-hmm.
the Muslims had done was to, in a sense, bring Muslims away from certain institutions that they were affiliated to new
Mm-hmm.
institutions like the mosque. So
Yeah.
that part of the social structure changed.
Yeah.
And also it changed the manner to which men and women interacted with one another. Because in
Mm-hmm.
Islam, there are some moral codes that were emphasized. Still, in as much as the things that are unchangeable did change how the social structure of Southeast Asians were like, there were also many things that Muslims did not change. And this is what we call as the changeable aspects of the social structure that need not be changed. So
Yeah.
Muslims respected certain age-old customs that were there. For
Mm-hmm.
example, in Minangkabau,
Yeah.
women were allowed to inherit property even before the coming of Islam. When the
Yeah.
Muslim missionaries and even scholars came to Minangkabau, Minangkabau is a place where many Muslim scholars were born and were raised. Some of the madrasas in Minangkabau were amongst the best in Southeast Asia. But
Yeah.
most of these ulama in the past were not against this whole idea of women inheriting property. Because to them, these are not issues that are fundamental to Islam. These are issues that are about social relations. Hence, many of these scholars allowed such practices to remain. And that can be seen in other realms of life, such as the dress codes. They did not emphasize that Muslims ought to wear Arabic clothes. They did not emphasize that Muslim men had to wear Arabic clothes. What they did was to ensure that the social structure that was there before the coming of Islam
Mm-hmm.
remained in some ways, but at the same time were given new meanings that reflected the Islamic idea of society, community, family, and social relations. So, Orientalists used to describe this as Islam as a mere veneer into the lives of the Southeast Asians. I disagree with this point of view, and I say, and I mentioned in my book
Yeah.
that it is not a veneer, rather, it is another form of infusion of values that became part and parcel of the values that were already there in Southeast Asia. The Muslims did not want to display values that were congruent to Islam. One value system that we can see among the Malays was the value of respect.
Mm-hmm.
Hormat menghormati. And when
Yeah.
Muslims came, the Arabs were very impressed of the fact that Malays were very respectful of others. They maintained those ideas. And the same is it with gotong royong, merantau, and so forth and so forth. And this is
Mm-hmm.
why I mentioned that we need to look at the cultures of Southeast Asia, especially of Islamic Southeast Asia, Muslim Southeast Asia, as a
Yeah.
mosaic rather than
Mm-hmm.
as layers that were stacked upon one another, because there were
Mm-hmm.
mosaics of different cultures. When we put them together, you have the Malay Indonesian culture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think what you have mentioned is very important for us to understand the how Islam it is practiced in South East Asia, especially in the Nusantara region, Prof. For us to really understand that Islam does not blanket everything, and to make it some sort like a monoculture element. Talking about monoculture, Prof. The Southeast Asia community has a we know it has a dynamic cultural character, but there are some countries in the region that we know of, like for example, in Thailand, in Indonesia, which can be considered as being monoculture. Do you consider the monoculture societies being a challenge to peaceful coexistence?
Mhm. Well, there are many countries all over the world are, in a sense, quite homogeneous.
Mm.
Japan is one of them. But
Yeah.
with the coming of globalization and with the rise of all of these new media technologies, no
Mm.
country, no society, no community can say that they are monocultural.
Mm.
Every community, even if they claim that they are quintessentially Thai, they would
Mm.
have some Western cultures that are already infused in their culture. So I would like to
Right.
begin by saying that there is no such thing as monoculture anymore now.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody is, in a sense, multicultural, whether they
Yeah.
accept it or not. Unless they
Mm-hmm.
are still in caves and jungles, everyone today are exposed to different ways of living, and we have incorporated them into the body of our lives.
Yeah.
Now, whether monocultural societies can be a challenge precisely because they no longer exist, what
Mm-hmm.
we need to be attentive of now is what has been called by the sociologist. His name is Amitav at Zioni. He's an American sociologist who wrote a book called The Monochrome Society. So we need to
Mm-hmm.
move from discussions over monoculture to
Yeah.
monochrome societies. What is a monochrome society? A monochrome society is a society that sees one way of living life as the only valid way. So even though they may be hybrid in terms of the cultures,
Yeah.
they only say that only one way of thinking, living, and manifesting the things that you believe in and the things that you do can be considered as the right way to live your life. So he was criticizing basically a culture or a group of people that we think are very multicultural. He was
Mm-hmm.
criticizing the American society. He said that the American society has become monochromic society, monochrome society, in the sense that you are either liberal or you are not. And when you are not accepted into that society. You are either Americanized, and here they say that you are Americanized with an emphasis on conformity, And he says that this is very, very problematic because as the world gets globalized, we are supposed to celebrate different ways of living, different ways of doing things, different
Yeah.
manifestations of our lives. Hence, his critique is actually a critique of not only America, but the
Yeah.
world, because America is now exporting its ideology to the rest of the world. We are
Yeah.
impacted what we call today as cancel culture, woke, and so forth and so forth. These are all manifestations of the rise of this monochrome society, a monochrome global society, where you either take it or leave it. You either take one or just, not be a part and parcel of that larger group. You either take the one way or the highway. And this is a challenge that we need to be attentive of. And this is actually happening today, not only in America, but also in Malaysia, where people are emphasizing that there is one correct way, there is no other way. And for me, this is a challenge, especially for Muslims,
Yeah.
where we are getting more and more highly ideological to the extent that we have become so rigid, so monochromic, that we are unable to understand that one of the reasons why Islam could flourish in this part of the world was
Yeah.
because different groups with different ideas, with different ways of thinking, with different manners of manifesting Islam came here and were celebrated and accepted by a group of people who wanted openness. And this is what we need to, in a sense, talk about more to
Yeah.
resist the rise of these monochrome tendencies.
Yeah, I think you have raised so many interesting and also crucial points to our discussion, Prof. So maybe as to conclude the first part of our interview this evening, Prof. Inshallah, we'll be talking about the same topic in our second part of the interview. What do you think about how Islam's role in the context of how it spread, and also how actually it has an important impact in Southeast Asia, Prof.
Yeah. So right now, Islam has a big role to play, not only in Southeast Asia but the world.
Yeah,
And the biggest role that it has to play, and this is something that I have mentioned in a new book that inshallah will be coming out early next year. The book is entitled Sufism in Southeast Asia. And one of the arguments that I made in the book is that one of the interesting thing about Sufism, and here we are talking about the Sufism that is based on the Quran and Sunnah,
yeah,
is that it emphasizes on the need for us to engage in dialogues.
yeah,
And this dialogical tradition is something that we need to recover again. For us to begin talking to one another, for
yeah,
us to begin interacting with one another as fellow human beings, not only as Muslims and non Muslims, not only as Malays and non Malays, not only as people of high class and low class, but rather
yeah,
as people who are part and parcel of humanity. We are faced with the challenge now that even families are not in dialogue with one another. We communicate with our wives, with our children, with our neighbors, with our communities through SMS. Sorry, no longer SMS, is actually old school. Through WhatsApp and
yeah,
through Signal, Telegram, and so forth and so forth. We no
yeah,
longer talk to one another. And now that I'm in Kuala Lumpur, even when I go out, to get my usual teh C or teh tarik, families are sitting together in a restaurant and nobody talks to one another.
yeah,
Bapa, Anna, they are just looking at their phones. And the best part, they even message each other when they are at home. So can you please take something for me in the kitchen? And this is the problem that we have. And Islam emphasizes a lot on interaction. And the Quran, Ud'u ila sabili rabbika bil hikmah wal mau'izatil hasana wajadilhum billati hiya ahsan. So call to people in the way of your Lord will with hikmah. So that means you must have wisdom. To have wisdom means you have to have dialogue with text and context. You have to be there with the people around you for them to see that you are the walking Islam. But more importantly, in the last part of the ayat, wajadilhum billati hiya ahsan, and have jidal, engage in conversations, in debates, in arguments, in interactions, in discourse, then we can enrich the world. And this is something that I think that is already in our religion, much
Yeah.
forgotten people in our religion, and we need
Mm-hmm.
to begin first between husbands and wives. We
Yeah.
have had an interview yesterday with
Mm-hmm.
another in another place. And I emphasize on this that if you look at the statistics here in Kuala Lumpur, and I want to say it again that
Mm-hmm.
the divorce rates are very high, not only amongst Muslims but also all across the board amongst all communities. The heart
Mm-hmm.
of the problem is communication, the
Yeah.
dialogical tradition, this discussion that we need to have, even if we disagree with one another, even if we don't like each other for some reason, we need to just talk it out as human beings, face to face, and we live this whole culture that we already have in Southeast Asia.
Right. I think your conclusion, some, some important points that I think we need to be alert of and be wary of, especially with regard to how that interaction plays a very important role for us to build peaceful coexistence, not just in the context of our multicultural society, the dynamics of our society in the region and also in Malaysia, but also how, in family institutions to strengthen the family institution. You mentioned about how we need to talk to each other. So, Prof, for our first part this week, inshallah, and thank you again for being with us on Open Forum, Prof. So, inshallah, we'll meet you again next week in our second part of our discussion on Islam and peaceful coexistence in Southeast Asia. And to our fellow listeners on Open Forum, inshallah, we'll meet again next week. And to my producer, Batrisyia, thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi taala wabarakatuh.
One.